Shalom, everybody. This is Tazara. I'm gonna try and make this a quick one. I'm gonna show y'all some stuff in this book that I found a little while ago, and it talks about Jews, Portuguese Jews, Black Portuguese Jews, being enslaved in America, South Carolina specifically. So, first, I want to take a look at this book because it talks about the Portuguese Jews being expelled from Portugal in the 15th century. I'm sure you guys have seen this one before. It's called the Hibernian Magazine or Compendium of Entertaining Knowledge, published in 1784. We're going to be on page 128. That's what it says right there. Got to zoom in. And we can start right here. It says King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the Black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Loango, who were despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. So it's talking about Jews being banished from Portugal. It says the Black Portuguese descended from these banished Jews, these Black Jews that were banished. And it says they were expelled to St. Thomas and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. Now, Cape Verde is going to pop up in this video. Cape Verde was a Portuguese settlement during this time period, all the way into, I believe, 1975 is when Cape Verde got its independence from Portugal. So from the 15th century to 1975, Cape Verde was a Portuguese settlement. So keep that in mind when we read about Cape Verde later on in this presentation. And just a quick FYI, I do have plenty of videos on my channel about Black Jews from Portugal, Black Jews in Portugal, all of that. So I'm not going to get into sources talking about all that, but you can scroll through my channel and easily find those videos. So this is the book that we're going to be reading from. Right here, you can see that it's called Carolina Genesis Beyond the Color Line, published in 2010. It was edited by Scott Withrow, so that's why you see his name right here. Scott Withrow was a history professor at North Greenville University before he retired. What this book is basically just a compilation put together by numerous different writers and authors and researchers. I believe it's about 5 or 6 different ones, and they each gave their input about different topics pertinent to the subject. So we're only going to be reading from one of these authors because only his writings is relevant to what the topic is. If you go to page 3 of the book, in the introduction, this is him right here. His name is Govinda Sanyal. Govinda Sanyal's follow-up essay, The History of My Amargarican Lineage in Sarah Junco, is about his own family, the Reed Junco family, using extensive background material. He takes the reader from North Africa to Mexico to New England to South Carolina. Considering the depth of this essay, it is evident that he has spent years completing this research, much of it original and painstaking. So if you look him up or if you look into him, Govinda Sanyal is an author known for his work on genealogy and historical research. I'm not going to go into him. You can look him up on his own, but we are going to read about some things that he wrote. So we're in the same book still, Carolina Genesis. We're going to start on page 96. I'm going to zoom in. Now, keep in mind, in the first book not too long ago, we read that Portuguese Jews were banished to St. Thomas and other Portuguese settlements on the African continent. And keep in mind that I pointed out how Cape Verde is or was a Portuguese settlement. So we're going to start right here on page 96. You can see we're still in the same book, Carolina Genesis Beyond the Color Line. And we're going to start at the top. This is Govinda Sanyal speaking about the research that he came into when researching his family. As mentioned earlier, John Moore captured my great-great-grandfather, the chief of High Log, July, and brought him to Pettigrew's plantation, pipe down in South Carolina. The Moors also orchestrated the bondage of my third great-grandmother, Mary Nancy Wabini Reed, the Narragansett from Rhode Island, where the Flagg family resided prior to the Revolutionary War. So he's basically giving some context into different slave-owning families and how some of his ancestors were slaves and all that. Rachel Moore Alston Bellin, the matriarch of the family through her Moore relatives and their familial connection and history, settled at Goose Creek, South Carolina, home to Indian slave traders from Barbados. These privateers, or Goose Creek men as they were known, also engaged in the forced labor of poor whites and had access to the slave markets of Charleston, South Carolina, and New England for generations. Sarah Moore Smith, a relative of Rachel Moore Alston Bellin, lived on Broad Street in Charleston, South Carolina, with her husband, Thomas Smith. Their residence was on the same street as the Postmaster General of South Carolina, Alfred Huger, at 128 Broad Street. Huger owned the mulatto. Notice mulatto is in quotes here. Huger owned the mulatto carpenters, George and Ned, the latter my great-great-grandfather. Ned was a Portuguese Jewish sailor and shipbuilder from the Cape Verde Islands. His plight was one of tragedy when South Carolina routinely captured non-European sailors and held them as slaves until evidence was produced sufficient enough to liberate them. Ned fell victim to the enslavement of free seamen of color when he was not able to provide a certificate of his free status. So let's stop for a second. You can see it says that this was his great-great-grandfather, Ned. And it says Ned was a mulatto, but also Portuguese Jewish, a Portuguese Jew. So when I see the word mulatto in sources, I always like to point out this painting right here. The mulattoes of Esmeraldas. You can see that these are quote-unquote mulattoes. The Mulattoes of Esmeraldas, also known as the Black Kings of Esmeraldas, is an oil-on-canvas work painted in 1599 by the mestizo painter Andres Sanchez Galque. So these guys were considered mulattoes back in 1599. It's a flexible term, and it doesn't always mean what people in modern times try to say it means. There could be a number of reasons why someone would be classified as mulatto. We're going to actually read why this Portuguese Jew was classified as a mulatto in this case. So let's go over this part one last time. Huger owned the mulatto carpenters George and Ned, the latter being Ned, my great-great-grandfather. Ned was a Portuguese Jewish sailor and shipbuilder from the Cape Verde Islands. His plight was one of tragedy when South Carolina routinely captured non-European sailors and held them as slaves until evidence was produced sufficient enough to liberate them. Ned fell victim to the enslavement of free seamen of color when he was not able to provide a certificate of his free status. So this is basically saying that Europeans or white people were capturing people who didn't look like them and enslaving them. Okay, this guy was a Portuguese Jew. He was caught up in this circumstance and he was enslaved because he wasn't white. Let's keep going. Fortunately, his owner, Postmaster General Alfred Huger, was a compassionate slave owner, a trait that he inherited from his father, John Huger, 1744 to 1804, who would insist that his children regard my or his Negroes as humble friends and their own fellow creatures, and to treat them with all the humanity and compassion which existing circumstances can admit of. So let me break this down real quick. It says that his great-great-grandfather, the person who's writing this, was a Portuguese Jew who was caught up in slavery because he wasn't white. And then the author goes on to say his owner, the Portuguese Jew's slave master, was compassionate, and that compassion was passed down from his father, who insisted that the Negroes be regarded as humble friends. So clearly this is identifying this Portuguese Jew as someone who would be a Negro, who would be classified as a Negro. Otherwise, this part right here would be completely irrelevant, concerning the fact that the slave master regarded his Negroes as humble friends. Now I want to scroll down a little bit to page 99 at the top. It says, as a carpenter in Charleston, Ned was most likely employed by the city's major carpenter, James Mitchell. Like Ned, Mitchell was said to be a Portuguese Jew, but considered as a free person of color, mulatto. Mitchell was formerly employed as a sailor by Solomon Moses from 1734 to 1828, a Newport, Rhode Island shipbuilder and slave merchant. Now this next part right here is important because it starts talking about white Spanish or Portuguese Jews. Sephardic means from Spain or Portugal. Jews with ancestry stemming back to Spain or Portugal. We can see clearly that the ones we read about earlier, the one we read about earlier was a black Portuguese Jew. Now it's going to jump to talking about Sephardic Jews that were white. Newport, Rhode Island was not unfamiliar with the Sephardic community. As early as 1654, Portuguese Jews established the first Jewish settlement. By 1658, 15 Jewish families arrived at Newport from Amsterdam, where Solomon Moses Sr. was born in 1734 and introduced Freemasonry, whose ancient beginnings are found among the Egypto-Moors. By 1732, Spanish Portuguese Jew from England settled in Savannah. At the same time, Oglethorpe began his colony with the aid of Tomochachi, the Yamakra Yamasee chief. So a little while ago we read about how this black Portuguese Jew, he was caught up in slavery, in a slave trade taken by Europeans because he was not European looking. He wasn't white. These Portuguese Jews are willingly coming over to America where Europeans are. They're setting up colonies. They're not being enslaved. That's because one group of Portuguese Jews looked one way, one looked the other. One group was black, one group was white. We read about a black one who got caught up in the slave trade, and now we're reading about white ones who came and settled and prospered. Now we're going to take a quick look at page 100 so we can highlight the differences between what black Portuguese Jews are doing compared to what white Portuguese Jews are doing. We're going to start right here. Moses Levi, the major slave merchant of Sephardic ancestry for the city of Charleston, resided opposite the Adger's Wharf on Trad Street, a dock for steamers from New York. Now it's talking about a Sephardic, or in other words, Spanish or Portuguese Jew, who was a major slave merchant of Sephardic ancestry. We read earlier, I'm going to point out again, that Ned, the author's great-great-grandfather, Ned, he was a Portuguese Jew, and he was caught up in slavery. He was enslaved because he wasn't white. And we read about how his slave master was, quote unquote, compassionate toward his Negroes. This Spanish or Portuguese Jew, Moses Levi, he's enslaving people. He's a slave merchant. So clearly, this is making it undeniably clear that when it comes to Spanish and Portuguese Jews, Sephardic Jews, they didn't all look the same. There were black ones, there were white ones. As we can clearly see from what we're reading, the black ones, in this case it's just one. This guy is talking about his specific ancestry, his ancestors. His black Portuguese ancestor was enslaved. Now he's writing about Portuguese or Sephardic Jews who were doing the enslaving. So they can't be all the same appearance. They can't all be the same race or color. If some of them are getting enslaved for not looking white and the other ones are enslaving people, it's talking about him enslaving black people here, this Sephardic Jew. Just put two and two together. Now we're going to take a quick look at page 102. We can start right here. It says the Moses family was a Sephardic Charlestonian slave trading family who in 1830 owned property at 130 Broad Street next door to the Postmaster General of South Carolina, Alfred Huger, at 128 Broad Street. All these slavers had a hand in the captivity of Ned, which is his great-great-grandfather, the black Portuguese Jew from Cape Verde, his wife Sarah Ann Flora Reed, and her mother Mary Nancy Reed, regardless of their benevolence, as in the case of Alfred Huger. So he's again highlighting the fact that other Spanish or Portuguese Jews, other Sephardic Jews, this family, had a part in enslaving his ancestor. He's saying the Moses family was a Sephardic Charlestonian slave trading family. Then he talks about Alfred Huger, who we read about first. And he says all these slavers had a hand in the captivity of Ned, which is his great-great-grandfather, the black Portuguese Jew that we read about at first. So what you have here is white Spanish or Portuguese Jews, white Sephardic Jews, enslaving a black Portuguese Jew, a black Sephardic Jew, making it undeniably clear that they did not look the same, that they were not the same race, quote-unquote race. Now let's take a quick look at page 103. 103. Let's start here. My great-great-grandfather, a carpenter named Ned Huger, was considered a mulatto because he was born in the Cape Verde Islands. So we read earlier that his great-great-grandfather, the carpenter named Ned, who was the black Portuguese Jew, was called a mulatto. Right here, he's explaining that he was considered a mulatto because he was born in the Cape Verde Islands. Not because of the way he looked. They called him that because of where he was from, where he originated from. Or not where he originated from, but where they first encountered him at. That's the only reason why he was called a mulatto. All right. Now, before I head out, I want to show you guys page 58 of the same book. You can see right here at the top, it says Carolina Genesis. This is a screenshot of the page. Um, this was also written by Govinda Sanyal, the guy who we've been reading about. He's been explaining his ancestry and things he's found while researching his ancestry. We're going to read the footnotes here at the bottom. It says C.A. Westlocker, Delaware's Forgotten Folk, The Story of the Moors and Nanticoke, Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, 1943. In 711 AD, the Moors crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and began their conquest on the Spanish peninsula. After governing Spain for 800 years, the Moors were defeated by the Christians, Celtics, and many of their descendants were sold to the slave traders who brought them in shackles to America. Some of these Moors were Mozarabes or Sephardic Jews. So he's flat out saying that Sephardic Jews or Spanish and Portuguese Jews were brought to America as slaves. He speaks about the specific scenario with his own ancestor and things that he researched and discovered pertaining to that. And he also says that in mass, Moors or Mozarabes or Sephardic Jews were brought to America as slaves in shackles. This quote, the majority of this quote comes from another source. I already did a video on my channel about this source. I'll put it in the description box. Those of you who want to see it can see it. But pretty much the author we've been reading from, he added some additional context with this sentence right here at the end, explaining that some of these Moors were Sephardic or Spanish or Portuguese Jews who were brought to America in shackles. Not just Moors, but Spanish and Portuguese Jews as well, as we can clearly see with the case concerning his own great-great-grandfather. So that's all I got for y'all today. Peace and blessings to everybody. Shalom.